Welcome to the latest Evershed Sutherland Legal Insights podcast.
Hi all, welcome to today's podcast. I'm Alex and I'm here with my colleague Jo. Today we're going to have a look at the FCA's latest findings on vulnerable customers, and we'll be discussing key themes from several recent publications and how these findings impact the retail finance market.
Hi everyone. As Alex said, we're going to be talking about the FCA's recent publications regarding their review on how firms identify and treat customers with characteristics of vulnerability, and how that then leads to firms delivering good customer outcomes. The publications that we're going to talk about today were all, I think, published around a week or so ago. And in case you missed them, there was a package of publications that came out. One was a consumer research paper on improving outcomes. The second was a paper looking at the FCA's findings from their recent review on the firm's treatment of vulnerable customers. And then there was another paper specifically about delivering good outcomes for customers in vulnerable circumstances. And we'll provide a link to those when the podcast is published.
That's right, Jo, and I think the consumer research paper was really interesting. And one of the key themes that comes out of that, together with the other publications, is the fact that firms could perhaps do more to encourage customers to share any characteristics of vulnerability. And interestingly, the FCA's press release encourages vulnerable customers to open up to firms to get that right support. I think part of the research shows that only 4 in 10 vulnerable customers disclose their needs to their financial services provider. However, those that do tend to disclose do then go on to have those better experiences.
Yeah, and that is really interesting. And I picked up on that as well, Alex, in the research paper. But it's a really emotive topic, isn't it? And I expect that some customers will worry that you don't want to share off, which is often quite personal information, if you're unsure about how that information will help or how it might be used. And I can understand nervousness around that. And it may also be the case that a customer with perhaps something which one would then go on to classify as a characteristic of vulnerability isn't actually impacting the customer at that particular moment in time. So it doesn't impact how they use the product or service or the support that they're getting. But the FCA's publications do seem to emphasise the importance of firms encouraging customers to share information by trying to ask the right questions and showing genuine care. And as you say, the research findings suggest that this can really improve the support provided to customers in the longer term. But, you know, while we all appreciate the benefits of this, and while none of us would disagree with any of that, I think this is really challenging to get right in practice. I expect that many members of staff may be worried about saying the wrong thing despite the training that they've had. And I guess that there'll always be some customers who, you know, despite encouragement, will still be reluctant to share.
Yeah, I completely agree, Jo, and I think that that's going to be a real challenge. The findings do flag the importance of firms properly defining what good outcomes look like, and understanding their customers' needs when thinking about product and service design. And that seemed to be one of the key themes that came out of this report, and the research is around that front end of the process. The findings also flag the need to ensure that staff have appropriate knowledge and skills to support customers, and that more can be done to ensure that the upfront design of the products and services support good customer outcomes, including for customers with characteristics of vulnerability.
Yeah, that was also really interesting. And again, something that I picked up on when reading through the publications. And on the training front, this isn't really just about making sure that the frontline or customer facing staff have appropriate training. This is about everyone across the organisation being aware of the practical impact of certain characteristics of vulnerability. And again, something that came out from the documentation was that I think we can often focus on the what rather than the how. And by that, I mean, I think we really try to classify characteristics of vulnerability based on the 4 drivers of harm, but we don't necessarily then go on to think about how a characteristic might impact the customer's ability to engage with a particular product or service, or to sort of go through the customer journey and get the good outcomes that they need.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I think I found the comments relating to the initial product design and service design really interesting. You know, that idea that you have to take stock right at the outset at design stage to truly understand the different groups of customers within your target market and what their needs might be. And again, that comes back to thinking about how particular needs impact their ability to engage throughout the customer journey and to get the benefits that the product or service is designed to offer. And I think, you know, it doesn't stop there then, does it? You've defined the outcomes, you've thought about your customer journey, you've thought about product and service design, and then it's really making sure that you've got the appropriate monitoring in place to check that these good outcomes are being delivered in practice. And this emphasizes again the real importance of continuous improvement. Putting the right monitoring in place has got to be essential for identifying those areas where vulnerable customers may be experiencing worse outcomes and then helping you address those issues promptly.
Absolutely. And I think that this then feeds into where data becomes key, which was the other key theme that we found from the review and the report, was around that good quality data. So in the delivering good outcomes for customers in vulnerable circumstances, good practice and areas for improvement document that was released as part of this package, the FCA explained that firms who collected relevant data to make evidence-based assessments of their customers' experiences were better able to understand whether they were delivering good outcomes. And of course, that comes back to what you've just said, Jo, about making sure that we have, or that firms have, defined what good means to them, and then using that data that's been collected to inform their approach on improving outcomes. And there's some really good examples in the good practice from the FCA. And one thing that I was going to draw on was in the areas for improvement, actually, in use of data, that the regulator found that firms often relied on data that lacked breadth and granularity, and that this limited their ability to compare and reach conclusions about outcomes for different groups of customers. And part of that survey, the MI that's frequently relied upon by firms are data including complaints data, staff feedback, and quality assurance findings. And there's far fewer respondent firms saying that they're using customer feedback directly from customers in vulnerable circumstances, behavioural insights data, and referral and take-up rates of additional support. So firms are often monitoring outputs of processes, labelling these as metrics and taking the time to consider how that data impacts the outcome. But I suppose there's a risk here of isolating the data too much and not looking at that bigger picture and thinking, well, this is for vulnerable customers, so ask vulnerable customers.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And often I think the data that you've described is data that's almost after the event data, isn't it? So you're looking at, you know, complaints is an example of, well, something obviously has, in the customer's eyes at least, gone wrong, because that's why you've received a complaint. I think what's really important is moving that focus, like you say, to other sorts of data that's probably more proactive. So, you know, getting customer engagement and feedback as you're designing things, as you're testing things. Also maybe, one thing that came out of the FCA webinar on this and the panel session at that was, I think one of the panel speakers referenced the fact that they use internal ally groups, and they look to leverage colleague experience. So when they're designing something or testing something, they're looking to get that critical feedback and input at a really early stage so that they can then design with that feedback in mind. And I guess it's making sure, therefore, you've got that right mix, isn't it, of data? So you've got that proactive stuff as well as looking at the reactive stuff when perhaps something has gone wrong. And then linking that to another important theme that came out of the findings was the clarity of customer communications and the importance of customer communications. And this is where consumer understanding and consumer outcomes, support outcomes under the duty intersect. effective communication is a really important part of the firm providing good customer support. And the findings suggest that, having these clear and helpful communications at the right time in the customer journey will help customers develop and deepen trust with financial services providers.
Absolutely. And I think that's really important, therefore, that firms really think about the timing, the channel, and the content of all customer communications to ensure that they meet the desired outcome, and deliver good outcomes for consumers. And the FCA particularly highlighted good practice around firms having different communication channels so that customers with characteristics of vulnerability could use the channel that best suited their needs and circumstances.
Yeah. And the other thing I think that was interesting, just in kind of moving on from that, was the commentary in the documentation around the intersectionality of different characteristics of vulnerability, and almost this idea of, customers can have a layering effect in terms of their needs and the characteristics that they have. And perhaps we often just think about one characteristic without thinking about kind of the knock-on effect for that. And again, this is where I think it's really then important to test ideas and communications so that you can truly understand the layering effect of customer needs and circumstances to make sure that customers really are getting the best outcomes and the best experience, because we can't design for something, can we, if we aren't aware of it and we don't necessarily understand it ourselves. So one of the things that I think is interesting for me is when you're thinking about response times to a particular call or call to action in the customer journey or a communication, are we designing that response time with all groups of customers in mind so that we're giving groups with different needs and characteristics adequate time to make informed decisions? Or are we just designing that response time with almost like the default customer in mind?
Absolutely agree. And whilst many of the findings are, I suppose, obvious, the publications do provide a lot of food for thought in some areas. And I expect that many firms will now be thinking about whether they can make improvements to their own processes and policies off the back of these reports that have been released. And it's really helpful that the FCA publishes its findings by way of good and poor practice examples, as it helps bring to life those findings. And I think that's on the whole what the industry have asked for and find most useful is the good and poor practices.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think they're so useful. And I think that, again, just to mention that FCA webinar that happened, I think it was last Tuesday, the 11th of March, the panel session from that webinar was really helpful in terms of bringing people together from industry and the FOS, and having a discussion about real life challenges and being able to offer some practical tips for firms in terms of how others are approaching this and thinking about it. And if anyone hasn't seen that yet or listened to the recording, I think we can include a link to the relevant FCA webpage when we publish this podcast later this week. Well, that's it, I think, for today. If anyone hasn't seen them, take a look at the publications. They're well worth a read. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that you found this chat helpful.
Thanks, Joanne. Speak to you all soon.
Thank you for listening to the Evershed Sutherland Legal Insights podcast.